Good afternoon. My name is Gillian Balaban and I am Senior Coordinator Governance Relations at GRI. Welcome to this meeting of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, known by its acronym the GSSB, held on 24 January 2023. This virtual meeting is being hosted from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Please note that all public GSSB meetings are being recorded and you can find the audio recordings on the GSSB webpage, along with the high-level summaries of previous GSSB meetings. Present from the GRI Secretariat today are Bastien Buck, Chief of Standards, and Nora Puro, Manager Sector Programmes. We will now start with a roll call. Anna Nefedova.
Hello, present.
Thank you. Corley Leroux.
Good afternoon, present.
Joseph Martin.
Present.
Thank you. Kent Swift.
Present.
Laura Donna Carter.
Good morning, present.
Good morning, Michelle Vassar.
Present.
Peter Colley.
Present.
Robin Leeson.
Present.
Vincent Kong.
Hi, present.
And GSSB Chair Judy Kosevsky.
Present.
Thank you all. GSSB members Kim Schumacher, Ganga Charan Sharma and Julia Genuadi will join shortly. And GSSB members Jennifer Prinsing and Evan Harvey sent their apologies. I will now hand over to the Chair, Judy Kosevsky, to open the meeting.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, colleagues, for being here today for this meeting of the GSSB. As Jill has just explained, we have a few of our colleagues joining us a little bit later. So for that reason, I think we will change the agenda around a little bit so that we do the approval of the draft summary of the December 2022 meeting when we have a quorum present. But the rest of the agenda is quite straightforward. We have an update from the standards division, and then we have a longer conversation about the exposure draft sector standard for mining, which we intend to bring for approval as an exposure draft today at today's meeting. And then we have a private session, informational private session later on. Any questions or additions to the agenda? Okay, hearing none, I will just go ahead and hand over to Bastien for the standards division update, and we'll monitor the quorum situation as we go along. As colleagues join, we can go back and approve the December meeting summary as required. Bastien.
Thank you, Judy, and hello, everyone. I will use my time today in the first meeting of the year to remind us all of, well, firstly, the success that we had last year, and I have the download figures of the GRI standards for you to exemplify that. But then also looking at the things that we've committed ourselves to as part of the standard setting activity. So a brief overview of all the running projects and things that we've set in motion. And of course, including also the important milestone that Judy just previewed in terms of an approval of the mining exposure draft. So if we can move to the first slide. It is great that I can do that because it is still something that surprises us. Year on year, we keep getting more successful when it comes to the GRI standards downloads. We've come very close to 1 million downloads last year. We keep adding also, and that's very important, to our user base. 93% of 88,500, around about 88,500 registered users last year are new leads, so people that come to GRI look at our contents and that we hopefully can make part of our network in the medium term. We have the ability to reach out to them and start the discussion with them. And we see this really around the globe. There are different, I think, growth patterns, but generally there's a healthy growth year on year that we see with our downloads in all the regions. If you can go to the next slide. So we see that also over the course of the year that we are trailing with the trends from prior years, and we continue to be above, significantly above what we've accomplished in 2021. It is, of course, of great interest for us to then continue to drive traffic through our main website. This is where we can also expose colleagues to other offerings that GI has and support and the membership and so on. But we see that we have a very steady, I think, traffic both to our website and then to search engine and so on. We will continue to monitor this. We will continue to update. We will also have KPIs for our communications and marketing function in relation to that. So this will keep coming back on a quarterly basis to you this year. But all in all, a very positive picture that we have double-digit growth once again in terms of the interest in the standards. And I see in the chat, Corley, your point about social media. Yeah, it is indeed interesting that when it comes to downloads, but that's not unusual, we are told. A lot of the traffic is actually through either engaging with the website or search engine results, and it is not where many of us tend to spend a lot of time looking at social media posts and all of that. But there is certainly something about actually also amplifying access to the standards through GI's social media strategy, so that this can probably go higher. But what we do oftentimes is redirect also through our social media posting people to the website, so familiarize them with the website as a go-to place for GI contents. Okay, if we move to the next slide, then I will briefly discuss the projects that are underway. Here, next slide, please.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Okay. We have the GSB work program, the draft work program in public consultation. The deadline is the 17th of February. And we aim to bring the feedback and the necessary discussion to our March in-person meeting. These are the next milestones. If you have contacts in your network that you feel should take note of this and submit a commentary, please remind them now. It's a couple of weeks to go. And we do want a public record of people engaging with us, of course. Next slide, please. On the sector standards front, we are starting now to really amplify the messaging around the textiles and apparel project. We will go out with an open call, and we hope to either in May or June have the slate for the working group together for your approval, and will commence then towards the end of the second quarter this year. Next slide. For financial services, you will see the final project proposal coming to you for the February meeting. We are in the midst of composing a technical committee, and we're putting a slate together for that as well. This will be slightly earlier. We've been working on this for a couple of months now. We hope in the March, April time frame to be able to come with recommendations for the 3 technical committees that we're composing here, and then have actually the first meetings before summer. Next slide, please. For the biodiversity project, we've spent some time on this in terms of updates, but here importantly, we are still in the public exposure phase for this. We've seen very healthy interest across many constituencies across the globe, and Harold, Elodie, Matthew, and others are very busy trying to coordinate all the different interests and be responsive also to the different forums where we can discuss the draft. So this all looks very, very positive, and we will then importantly have to consolidate around the feedback received and decide on the further timeline for the year. Next slide, please. Next slide. This is more information that we included in your package. So there's been significant activity in terms of the webinars as well. And when you look to the registrations and then also the viewers, hundreds of people have participated so far. Now we're going into a number of regional events and stakeholder specific events. Next slide. Some of the media coverage. And next slide. Next slide. Okay, for the labor standards, we are now, after having concluded almost on the advisory group experts, we're gearing up for the 3rd technical committee meeting, which is, I think, next week, yes. And we are aiming to have a first group of standards out for public exposure in the first quarter of next year. So a lot of content activity will happen, development activity. And the important reminder here, it's a portfolio project. It's a significant number of standards that we will be reviewing, exact details to be determined. But these are multiple standards that will also go for public comment in a first phase. Next slide, please. For the climate standard, you will also see the final project proposal for approval in February. And then we look to accelerate our recruitment efforts around the technical committee and start meeting with them as soon as possible. We are spending time on trying to understand the additionality of our work vis-a-vis the work of EFRAG and ISB in particular. And I think that will also determine the exact timeline for our project. So we keep working on that and refining it. But for now, we assume that the timeline will unfold in a similar fashion as for other standards projects that we've seen in the last years. Next slide. On economic impacts, another portfolio project, we will look to develop a first project proposal for discussion. This will take probably a bit more time to get the whole project up and running in terms of forming an opinion on the scope, both first internally and then in discussion with you. We're looking at GRI 201, 202, 203 of the existing standards, but there is a whole host of discussions, of course, outside this that would fall under the economic impacts scope. Next slide, please. An update on the translations. We are now really concluding on the translations for the universal standards and oil and gas. And we're moving towards the sector standards, coal and agriculture, aquaculture, and fishing. And we hope to conclude on those efforts on the standards that have been released in late 21 and during the course of 22 within the next 3 months. So by end of March, we're going to conclude on the bulk of those sector translation, standard translations. And that is a very ambitious agenda. We had the universal standards work stretching out a bit in terms of timeline, because it was the first time that we've put this through our new technical capabilities, the content management system, and also releasing different language versions. But now the team has actually caught up with all the technology struggle, and you will see much more seamless issuing of standards in translated form after we have released the English version. Yes, I think that concludes it on translations. I want to pause here before I hand over to Nora for the approval for the GI sector standards project for mining. Are there any questions about the updates on the projects?
Thanks, Bastian. Anyone have any questions? I see that Corley has put she's put a question in the meeting chat about the impact or lack of it via social media channels. I'm wondering if this is something, Bastian, that in a future meeting we can invite some colleagues from the comms team to come and talk to us about maybe a little bit more depth about some of this, just to inform the perspective of the GSSB. I don't know that you and I necessarily know the answer to this question.
No. Yeah, I think the one thing I can say is that as part of looking also how we want to drive more uptake of the standards and actually getting exposure of the standards to relevant audiences, there is something around social media that we don't have quite right. Having said that, anecdotal evidence from discussions that we have around how downloads of documents, and that's what we're still looking at, right? You're not it's not an app or type environment where we present the standards. It's PDF based. That seems to be primarily driven through search engines and websites, so it's not uncommon that you see that, and that the impact of social media postings to drive actual downloads of something is actually oftentimes exaggerated. But having said that, there's probably a lot more we can do. Certainly, when you look at the traction that GRI has through some of these channels, which is very significant, where we're really industry leaders in terms of the network that we can bring together in these channels. But that's something we can look at, and I hope to be able, maybe in the March meeting, to have a briefing session of the comms colleagues.
Yeah, I think, Bastian, you know, we certainly don't want to be resting on our laurels here, but the growth figures for 2022 are, you know, every year the uptake increases, and yet every year it comes as a surprise, you know, just kind of how much growth can be achieved on a year-on-year basis with a well-established, you know, GRI is 25 years old. This whole framework has been around for a while, and yet the interest just keeps growing and growing. So I think I'll pay tribute to all of the efforts by everyone on the GSSB, but also within the Standards Division and our colleagues in the GRI Secretariat for just keeping it going, and not just going, but growing and increasing all the time. It's really a tremendous achievement. Any other questions before we move ahead in the agenda? I understand we've now been joined by Julia Januardi and Ganga Sharma, and this means that we have a full quorum at this point, so we can go ahead with the various things that we need to do in this meeting. Welcome to both Ganga and Julia, and while we're here, why don't we've flipped back in the agenda here so that we can hopefully approve the draft summary of the GSSB meeting held on the 15th of December 2022. Are there any comments, questions, objections, edits that members want to make? Hearing none, that is approved. Thank you very much for that. And unless there's further appetite to talk further about the various updates that Bastian has just shared with us, we will go ahead in the agenda with so this is, as you know, we are planning today to approve the sector standards project for mining as an exposure draft. And so Noura from the standards division will be here. If she's not here right now, I'll just hand it over to her to talk us through this part of the agenda. Noura.
Thank you very much, Judy, and good morning, good afternoon to all members of the board. Thanks for being present here today with us. So I have the pleasure today to be here on behalf of the sector standards team, and we'll spend the next half hour or so talking to you about the project for mining. So this is the first one to be developed after the pilot projects have been launched. So we're putting our process and developing these standards and the format as well to test. And so far, we have to say with fairly good results, but we'll leave that for you to judge. We can move on to the next slide, please, Jill. So here, just to recap the objectives of the project, which are shared usually across sector standards. So the standard aims to identify and describe the topics that are likely to be material for reporting by mining organizations based on the sector's most significant impacts. We also aim to provide evidence and authoritative references for these impacts, as well as list relevant disclosures for reporting on these topics by the sector. And as you will recall, the disclosures listed, they come primarily from the GRI topic standards, but are also sometimes supplemented with reporting expectations for specifically for the sector, for such impacts that are either unique to the sector or have an outsized significance for the sector. We can move on to the next slide, please. So to build the contents of this sector standard, we were very lucky to attract an incredibly knowledgeable, active, and collaborative working group of 20 members. Their contribution so far has been quite impressive, and the commitment shows no signs of wavering. So I want to send big compliments to all of them already at this point. So from a business perspective, we have tried to ensure a diversity of commodity experience, as well as large cap and mid cap representation. We also have a strong civil society presence covering all dimensions of sustainability, as well as 4 continents. Labor and investor constituency each have 2 representatives, and then we have a fairly strong mediating institution group as well. It was found important to include representatives from various sector relevant standard setters or responsible business frameworks. Coppermark and IRMA are examples of these. And I will talk a little later about other alignment and collaboration efforts outside of this list. Mediating institutions also include highly relevant organizations such as the World Bank, as well as Mining Shared Value, which deals with the local procurement issues. Next slide, please. So this slide is to illuminate the sustainability context for this sector. This was kind of the starting point for developing the standard. So for mining, and specifically, the demand of certain minerals is expected to grow exponentially in the years to come. To mention some figures here, in light of the necessary measures to tackle climate change, the International Energy Agency estimates that the shift to a clean energy system is expected to drive a huge increase in the demand for minerals. For example, copper might increase with 40%, lithium almost 90%. These are, of course, potential figures. So according to the technology developments, these might change. So whatever our goal is it below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, enormous amounts of minerals are needed. And this, of course, can result in a large number of impacts on the environment, as well as communities surrounding operations. while also having major consequences on national economies for resource-rich countries. And as of these two realities, there is concern about how these minerals will enable the energy transition. Will they be mined in a just, equitable, and responsible manner? And the graph shown on the slide represents the priorities that the working group members mentioned when applying for the role. So what they considered as the biggest challenges facing the sector. Almost a quarter of the most relevant topics mentioned were about the social license to operate and contribution to communities, including topics such as relationships with indigenous peoples, bringing benefits to local communities, engagement with artisanal small-scale miners, land rights, these types of impacts. Climate change was also mentioned as one of the most relevant matters, including issues such as disclosure of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, energy efficiency measures, adaptation to climate impacts, and so on. And following these, the topics ranged from increasing stakeholder awareness about the sector's impacts to environmental management, health and safety, closure plans, access to information, technology automation, and so on. And a lot of these inputs were used as a foundation in the development of the standard, including the section Sector and Sustainable Development. Next, we can look at the timeline, that how we got here. So the project was originally commenced in 2021 when the project proposal was approved by the board mid-2021. The working group was formed towards the end of that year, and the first time the working group was convened was in February 2022. We have so far had 5 joint working group meetings, as well as around 5 subgroup meetings discussing specific topics separately. We finished a first draft of the sector standard mid last year. We also established a peer review to test the contents, and the working group received the exposure draft for fatal flaw review in December. And this brings us, of course, to this moment today, where we'll be discussing and hopefully approving the exposure draft. We can move on to the next slide, please. So to summarize the significant proposals in this draft, the working group identified 25 topics as likely to be material for organizations in the mining sector to report. And this reflects the sector's major impacts on sustainable development. Most of the 25 topics were similar to those included in GRI 11 oil and gas and GRI 12 coal sector standards, as was expected to be shared impacts across all extractive sectors. However, 3 topics are new or new-ish in this standard, though some of the contents in 2 of these new topics were included in one way or another in the other 2 extractive standards, but as part of a larger topic. On reporting, it became again very apparent from the working group inputs that there is a clear need for meaningful sector-specific reporting. This can be seen from the fact that most likely material topics list also additional sector reporting recommendations in addition to the GRI topic disclosures. And of course, part of this is related to the sheer volume of the sector's impacts, but the other side is also that the mining sector is already subject to significant transparency expectations, and these various expectations are also reflected in this exposure draft. The additional sector reporting was identified by the working group as critical for reporting, and the exclusion of this information from reporting would mean to many that it was incomplete. And there were some concerns raised by the working group over the voluntary nature of sector-specific reporting. And this is especially the case with topics that don't have an existing GRI topic standard, where the sector disclosures, together with the GRI 3.3 management of material topics, form the sole means to assessing an organization's impacts and how they are managed. Another key thing to mention about reporting is that mine site level data emerged as a key expectation across several topics. In fact, around half of the topics include expectations for mine site level data. So this is of course due to the significance of impacts experienced locally from mining activities, and there was clearly a need for transparent and timely mine site level reporting on environmental, social, and economic information, so spanning all dimensions. While this will likely increase the extent and granularity of reporting, the relevance of this type of reporting to meaningfully understand impacts was acknowledged across the board by all stakeholders in the working group. It was also noted that many organizations are already, in fact, collecting information on a site level for internal or corporate reporting purposes. So this exposure draft includes mine site level reporting for topics such as GHG and air emissions, tailings, closure, rehabilitation, community-related impacts, critical incident management, and payments to government, to mention a few. And on the sector context, I already mentioned on the previous slide the growing importance of acquiring that social license to operate, which will be even more highlighted because of the boom to mine critical minerals for the energy transition. So on the next slide, you will see the full list of topics included in this draft, all 25. And as mentioned, many of these correspond to those listed in GRI 11, GRI 12. In fact, the vast majority of these, with only a few exceptions. So in addition to climate, environmental topics are naturally well represented, being an extractive industry. Air emissions topic, for example, had a lot of discussion about dust, about mercury and hydrogen cyanide, for which reporting expectations were added that were not reflected in GRI 11 and GRI 12. For water, acid mine drainage has been included as an additional reporting expectation. And for waste, the streams most material for mining organizations were determined as rock waste and tailings. Some discussion on circularity is also included within the waste topic. Closure and rehabilitation then emerged as one of these very cross-dimensional topics, where we included many sector-specific recommendations, of course, because it doesn't have a corresponding topic standard in the GRI system. So this topic includes reporting on environmental impacts, on social impacts, as well as some financial metrics also on the financial provisions for closure. Then we have the community impacts, which are discussed across several standalone topics. These include both economic contributions of mining organizations to communities, as well as regions, as well as nations, and social impacts such as land rights and resettlement, community relations and engagement, and security issues. The topics also include some granularity in terms of stakeholder groups or community groups, in the sense that indigenous peoples have their own topic, as well as artisanal small-scale mining, as their impacts are and their management are quite distinct. For health and safety, we have topics related to, or disclosures separately related to critical incidents and occupational health and safety, in that critical incidents can have wider impacts than only for workers. The name of critical incident management deviates from GRI 11 and GRI 12, in which standards it was called asset integrity and critical incident management. But for the mining sector, asset integrity was not seen as applicable. It was mostly seen as applying to tailings. And because we have a standalone topic for tailings, we left that out from the name. And this shorter name also aligns with the proposed topic standard project that is scheduled to start, if I'm not mistaken, later this year, covering significant spills and other significant or critical incidents. Then we have a cluster of employment topics, with some of the topics relevant for major mining organizations, mostly through business relationships. Actually, Jill, you can go back to the next previous slide. It's just a lot of explanation about this list. Bear with me, please. So some of these topics indeed were seen as mostly relevant for mining organizations through business relationships, such as child labor, as well as forced labor and modern slavery. And finally, we have the kind of financial transparency topics where we have good alignment with the reporting included for oil and gas and coal standards, some of which align with the EITI reporting expectations, such as for beneficial ownership, contract transparency, and reporting financial flows on a project basis, project or mine site. Of these topics, 4 don't list any disclosures from the GRI topic standards. So 14.6 tailings, 14.12 land and resource rights, 14.13 artisanal small scale mining, 14.25 conflict affected and high risk areas. So for these topics, there is no existing corresponding GRI topic standard. So additional disclosures were developed by the working group or applied from other normative reporting instruments that are already widely used by reporting organizations. And 17 of these topics that do list disclosures from GRI topic standards also include additional sector reporting, and only 4 did not list any additional sector reporting. Now we can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So these topics that are highlighted on the slide are the so-called new topics. So tailings, as well as conflict affected and high risk areas, they are mainly based on contents that form part of other topics in GRI 11 and GRI 12, namely tailings was incorporated into asset integrity and critical incident management, and the conflict aspect was in a topic called conflict and security. So join putting together the security practices topic and conflict. But these were indicated by the working group that that more prominence is needed, and they weren't standalone topics. And only one is genuinely new to the standards, and this is the topic 1413, artisanal and small scale mining. And I will talk to these on the next slide a little bit more. So for artisanal and small scale mining, we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the rationale for inclusion for the first topic was that individuals and communities engaged in artisanal small scale mining are considered a key stakeholder group for many mining organizations. They are also a large group. There's an estimated 40 to even 50 million people engaged in ASM, as compared to circa 7 million workers engaged in industrial mining. And this means that a lot of mining organizations come into contact with ASM, which triggers impacts ranging from disputes and incidents to impacts on ASM communities' livelihoods. And while ASM happens mostly on an informal basis, there are expectations arising for mining organizations to also engage with ASM operators, specifically legitimate ones, and also support them to formalize and improve their operations and mitigate those negative impacts that can be linked to ASM operations. These include, for example, the use of mercury or the presence of child labor, so very severe impacts. And therefore, we've included reporting on this topic related to the management of the topic. We've asked organizations to describe the approach to engaging with legitimate ASM operators and the process used to determine whether they are legitimate or not. We also asked them to describe the programs they have in place to enhance positive impacts or mitigate negative impacts involving ASM, and how engagement with local authorities and communities has informed them. So the community component there is also very, very important. And for the additional sector disclosures, we have a metric to list the mine sites where ASM occurs on or in close proximity to the site, and to report the total number and nature of incidents and conflicts that involved ASM, and what sort of actions were taken to address these. The next topic here on the slide is conflict affected and high risk areas, which, as mentioned, expands on the contents that were in GRI 11 and 12 as part of conflict and security topic. As you know, many mining organizations operate or have business relationships in regions that are affected by armed conflict. And in these regions, there is a higher risk of human rights abuses, such as forced labor, child labor, sexual violence, and other violations of international humanitarian law. And there's also the risk of being complicit in illicit financial flows. And the working group recognized that there might be some overlap in reporting with other material topics such as anti-corruption or security practices. It was seen as important to acknowledge that these situations do require enhanced due diligence to put a spotlight on whether a company has made efforts to identify those red flags and risk factors when operating in these areas. The disclosures primarily draw from the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible supply chains of minerals from conflict-affected and high-risk areas. And they ask companies to list the locations of operations in these areas, how these were identified, because there are also many lists drawn what constitutes as a conflict area. We also asked them to describe the due diligence process applied for operations in or when sourcing from conflict-affected and high-risk areas. We asked for alignment, whether there's alignment or compliance with the OECD due diligence guidance. And we also asked to report a summary of the outcomes of impact or risk assessments in cases where no public due diligence report exists. The final topic on this slide is tailings, which again expands on the contents that were one way or another included in GRI 11 and GRI 12. So the focus of this topic is on the safety of tailings facilities, which upon catastrophic failures can cause disastrous impacts on the environment, on communities, including the destruction of whole villages. The reporting disclosures listed are primarily based on and aligned with the global industry standard on tailings management, which was published in 2020. Now we can move on to the next slide. So the other things to note about these draft contents is that there is a slight change in scope for the climate topics as opposed to oil and gas and coal. With the mining group, I wanted to put emphasis on community resilience and adaptation. So both on how mining companies are adapting and anticipating impacts in their own operations, but also helping communities to adapt now and in the future. The transition element was not seen as applicable to the mining sector as for the fossil fuels, as there are, as of now, no realistic expectations for mining companies to transition to other business models and abandon mining. On the contrary, there are expectations for mineral demands to grow. The working group also proposed many additional disclosures in addition to those now listed in the draft, for example, related to net zero commitments, science-based targets, but as these were not sector-specific recommendations and we have an ongoing climate project, we decided to park these and instead communicate these feedbacks to the climate project to take into consideration in their development process. For the biodiversity topic, as you know, we have the public comment period ongoing, and we decided to list disclosures from the revised exposure draft into our exposure draft, aiming to solicit more accurate feedback on potential sector-specific gaps for mining. So this is also a test. We haven't done this before, but we expect more of these types of situations in the future as we're ramping up standards development across the division. The final 3 points on this slide are all related to social aspects. So a lot of emphasis was put to reporting on benefits to communities, so how the negative impacts are balanced with positive ones. And community engagement was also kind of a cross-cutting aspect in many topics. So not only in the local community topic, but also in others like climate adaptation, closure and rehabilitation, and critical incident management. And finally, gender emerged as a focus for the sector, both in terms of impacts on the community as well as in the workforce. While we contemplated a standalone topic for gender, in the end, we ended up adopting this mainstreaming approach where gender aspects were incorporated into other topics. Then next slide, just a few words about how we tested the contents ahead of the public comment. So once we had finalized the first draft of the standard mid last year, we engaged a few dozen sector experts outside the working group to ask for their feedback. This was done in September. Specifically, feedback was solicited on the list and scope of the likely material topics, the relevance and level of detail and balance of selected topic descriptions, and relevance of the proposed additional sector reporting and potential gaps. And we had an online session for 2 hours with almost 30 peer reviewers present. You can see the organizations on the slide here. We also pursued additional individual engagements to collect written feedback on specific topics and perspectives, such as coverage of quarrying in the standard and additional expertise on operating in conflict areas. We had discussions with the OECD and the Red Cross, for example. We also got some great feedback on our rights of indigenous peoples topic from relevant stakeholders. And we did an additional interview in Spanish due to language constraints, covering a very important commodity, lithium, for the sector. Overall, the peer reviewers were very positive about the completeness and relevance of the topics currently included in the standard. There were no suggestions to leave out any topics. Some discussion was related to the granularity and different scopes of the topics, where some topics were perceived as being very granular in scope, such as air emissions, and others potentially as too broad, for example, local communities, which incorporates engagement, relations, health and safety, all these kinds of impacts. Next slide, please. This ties a little bit to the previous slide in that one of the peer reviewers that we engaged was a member of an indigenous peoples community. And this is a feedback that we received also in previous projects for oil and gas and coal, that the current spelling convention in the GRI standards, which is to not capitalize indigenous peoples, this received negative feedback from several stakeholders. So currently the term is not capitalized, which is based on the spelling conventions of international instruments such as the UN and ILO. And that also forms the basis for the existing GRI glossary entry. We did conduct some desk research on common conventions, but did not find clear consensus on the capitalization of the term. So it was both versions are used, and both can be considered as grammatical. But for the groups themselves, capitalization of the words, many communicated that it is considered as a sign of respect and recognition of a distinct identity. So the standards division recommends implementing this recommendation. So capitalizing indigenous peoples across the GRI standards. And this can be done efficiently in the publication platform for the GRI standards, but might require some manual work to update in other publications. And the glossary term will be more broadly inspected in the context of the revision of the community-related standards, of which GRI 411, Rights of Indigenous Peoples, will be part. This is scheduled to start next year. I think I have 2 slides left, and then we can pause for discussion and questions. This is also just a minor note about 2 revisions to the topic statements that were implemented to this exposure draft. So as you may remember, each likely material topic and topic description starts with a topic statement. So this provides a brief general description of the topic and its boundary. The topic statement reflects the definition and approach to the topic outlined in the topic standard and is consistent across sector standards wherever possible. So a change in a topic statement in one standard has implications for other existing sector standards. So sometimes the decision we made in the first pilot project was not necessarily the right one and needs to be revised. And these are the two examples that we have found in this project. So a minor change for the greenhouse gas emissions. We have removed the examples of carbon dioxide and methane from the existing or the old topic description because they are not always necessarily the most prominent GHGs for all sectors. So it was this more simplified version is seen as more applicable to many other sector standards. And for local communities, we added two words to communicate that the community engagement is to be conducted to understand the vulnerabilities and priorities of local communities. And this was seen as a positive evolution of the topic statement. Unless there are objections from the board to these revisions, they will be then implemented to other sector standards after the final mining standard is approved. So not yet at this stage, but when we have a final standard. If we move on to the next slide, it's my final slide before a little pause for questions and discussion.
I just have a question. Can you go to the previous slide quickly? I didn't fully hear what was the reason for taking out methane, because there's another standard, or I didn't fully hear.
So taking out carbon dioxide and methane. Was that the question, Kim?
Yeah, that was the question. Yeah. So why specifically those? Because it's too limiting, or too.
Exactly. So in the previous sector standards, the topic description has included these two examples. So air emissions that contribute to climate change, such as carbon dioxide and methane. But while they are relevant, of course, to the mining sector as well, but they might not always be the most relevant greenhouse gases related to a sector's activities. So we propose to just remove these examples and leave it at this simple form that contribute to climate change.
Thank you.
Okay. So this final slide is just to illustrate a little bit about the alignment and collaboration efforts. So as mentioned before, it's a sector with already heavy transparency and responsible business practice expectations. And it was seen as crucial for this project to align wherever possible with existing frameworks and not reinvent the wheel. So we have these few organizations in the working group that also provide guidance and metrics to their members or reflect expectations from further down the value chain. In addition, we had in the peer review, these organizations such as Alliance for Responsible Mining, which has developed the Fair Mine standard aimed at ASM activities, and Aluminum Stewardship Initiative, which has a standard to drive responsible production, sourcing, and stewardship in the global aluminum value chain, and EITI and Responsible Minerals Initiative were also consulted. Then other ongoing engagements include, on a project level, close collaboration with EFRAG. So their representatives were present in our peer review session, and we have also sat on their technical expert group meetings, providing in-depth input and alignment recommendations to their draft sector standard development on coal and mining, which is their pilot sector to develop reporting for. OECD was also engaged during the peer review phase, including to receive views on the conflict topic, which is based on the OECD due diligence guidance. In addition, we continue to communicate to OECD and IFRS on a continuous basis about our work within this project, in addition to the higher level efforts on the sector level. This was it for now. Would be great to hear if there are any any questions, any discussion to be had. So I will hand over to you, Judy, now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nora, and thank you for that comprehensive walkthrough of the program and what it has resulted in with this draft exposure draft for public comment. Thank you, Nora, for your leadership and your guidance on that working group as well. And we can see here how much collaboration has already taken place kind of across the relevant organizations that are most active and possessing a lot of expertise in this area. So are there, Peter Colley, please go ahead. Yes, if there are any questions or comments, please just raise your hand or flag for me somehow that you'd like to raise a point. Peter, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, this is 3 quick observations rather than questions. Firstly, all credit to the Standards Division and the Project Working Group for this draft. I've had occasion to talk to the Labor colleagues on the Project Working Group, and they stress that this is a consensus outcome and it hasn't been easy to achieve, but it has been done. That said, I thought the sector profile was unduly positive in the sense that it didn't adequately cover, I didn't think it covered the actual and potential negative impacts of the sector, but there's certainly the topic disclosures themselves, topic sector descriptions and the disclosures do cover quite adequately the actual and potential negative impacts. So I think overall it's well balanced. The third quick observation is about, which Nura has talked about, is the increased emphasis on site-by-site reporting. That certainly is where a lot of the debate is in the mining sector these days, in sustainability reporting and in, well, even in financial impacts of particular projects. I think we are seeing the evolution of sustainability reporting here from estimates and general descriptions to more data-driven, more empirically based reporting, and that's good to see. It will be a challenge for mining companies. I think they do actually collect this data, but the challenge is always collecting it in a standardized format in a manner that stands up to public scrutiny, and achieving adequate context in doing so. But I'll leave it there. It is an impressive draft. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Great comments, and I can tell you that the sector profile is one of the sections that truly showed the difficulty of bringing all of those different viewpoints to the table and creating a very concise description of the sector's sustainability context. But if you have any specific recommendations on how to bring more balance to that section, we'll be happy to hear on writing, for example, afterwards. But good to hear that the descriptions are balanced.
I won't make any suggestions for changes. As I said, I think the balance, particularly when one takes into account the topic disclosures and descriptions, is fine, is good. Thank you.
Great to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from GSSB members? No? Well, I think, Nora, that just demonstrates how much support there is already in the room for this process so far. I think we can go ahead and move now to the approval of the sector standard project for mining exposure draft. And I will therefore just call the question, does the GSSB approve this item 2 in our agenda today, GRI sector standard project for mining exposure draft? Any discussion, concerns? Hearing none, we take that as approved. Thank you very much, GSSB members, and to the Standards Division and the project working group. Very deep appreciation for all your efforts. Can you tell us now what the next steps are, please, Nora?
Would be pleased to do that. Thank you very much to the board for your confidence. We're very excited to start this next important phase in the project. I also want to thank the working group for their inputs and all other experts we've reached out to who've been supporting us throughout this process. And of course, the project team. So Julia and Alex for your relentless work, and our editorial and technical teams. And of course, Mia, who's been our unwavering rock throughout this process. But so next, I'll quickly tell you about the plans we have for the public comment period. So we aim to solicit input on the draft contents, whether these are the correct likely material topics, the impacts, are they the most relevant for the sector? And we'll be looking for views on the disclosures, whether they reflect the stakeholder expectations on transparency, and that they are feasible to report on, especially, as Peter also mentioned, the site level data is of particular interest. In addition, we'll be targeting key regions and markets for the sector, some specific stakeholder groups such as civil society and community representatives, and other areas of expertise. And on the next slide, we have listed some plans on the public consultation. We aim to launch on the 7th of February, so in about 2 weeks in Cape Town. We'll be attending Mining Indaba, that mostly convenes business and investor groups, as well as Alternative Mining Indaba, which is targeted at civil society and community groups. And there we will facilitate a 90-minute workshop to receive feedback on the draft's contents. We will also have global webinars that will be organized at different time zones to cater both the North American, South American, as well as Australian audiences. In other key regions, in addition to Africa, where we intend to have additional engagements, include Australia, China, India, Latin America, North America, and Indonesia. And the public consultation will close on the 30th of April. My final slide today is to inform you that you have received, as part of the meeting materials, the draft questions for the public comment questionnaire. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, suggestions to these, please let us know, let Jill know by the 1st of February, so that we'll be able to make the needed revisions to the online form on time. For now, I say very much thank you, and until we meet next.
Thank you very much indeed, Nora. That is excellent, and thank you to the GSSB members. We are virtually on time. We're a few minutes over what we expected to be this portion of the public part of the meeting. It brings us to the end of the public agenda. Is there any other business that members would like to raise? Hearing none, then it just remains for me to thank everyone for their participation today, and to close this part of the meeting. We will have an informational discussion in private session briefly, but thank you for everyone who has participated today. So let us close the meeting now, and